Hello and thank you for joining us on this episode of Chamber Connections. I'm Daniel Tisch, CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. On this show, we're endeavoring to engage in deeper conversation around public policy issues. We're exploring the diversity within the Chamber's business network and highlighting the contributions of business to our different communities. It's appropriate that today, our topic connects small business, Indigenous reconciliation, and what it means to our local communities. And I'm really excited to welcome Tabatha Bull to the OCC studios. Tabatha is a proud member of the Nipissing First Nation, and she's the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. She's also a member of the Ontario Chamber Board. Tabatha is dedicated to rebuilding and strengthening the path toward reconciliation and fostering a prosperous Indigenous economy for the benefit of all Canadians. She has a background in electrical engineering, and she's known for her commitment to Indigenous inclusion and diversity, particularly in Canada's energy sector. Tabatha's dedication to diversity extends to her efforts to remove systemic barriers, to enhance opportunities for Indigenous businesses and for women across all industry sectors. Thank you for joining us, Tabatha.
Thank you for having me.
So earlier this year, you and I co-authored an op-ed in the Toronto Star where we talked about an interesting dilemma, right? That more and more Canadian businesses are doing things like celebrating National Truth and Reconciliation Day or celebrating Indigenous Heritage Month. But at the same time that many were struggling to move forward in a meaningful way. What's your sense of the successes and also the challenges that we face today in getting businesses to engage in the reconciliation journey?
I think we're definitely seeing an increase in businesses that want to understand what their role is, and positively businesses in sectors that typically wouldn't have to have meaningful conversations with communities. You know, in the past, it was really about organizations or businesses that were having a direct impact on like resource extraction or consultation around land. And those organizations are a little further ahead because they really had to build meaningful relationships with
they
communities.
Had little choice,
exactly.
Right?
But now we're seeing more and more organizations in IT, as an example, and in travel, tourism, who are wanting to understand what role could they play and how can they support Indigenous communities and how can they learn more about the history of the country. But we have a long way to go still, and we definitely see a rise in requests and in celebration and acknowledgement in June and September, but we need to ensure that conversation happens throughout the year.
All year round, yeah, absolutely. And the Ontario Economic Report, which we issued earlier this year, we actually asked small businesses where they were on that reconciliation journey. And fewer than 20% had actually begun the journey, right? A lot of them were stuck. And a number said they didn't feel confident in how to get started. What advice would you give that kind of business? That they have good intentions, but they're not really sure where to begin?
I was surprised a bit about that stat, actually, because at Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, we are seeing so many corporations who are trying to do the work, and many have been doing the work for 40 years, as long as we've been here. But I think smaller businesses who maybe don't have an opportunity to have a national focus in working with communities struggle a little bit with even understanding how can they start that conversation. Right. And I think just as humans, it's always a bit unnerving to step into a space where you don't want to make the wrong statement or ask the wrong question.
There's a lot of fear of making a mistake.
For sure. Like, it really does take courage to really step into the space. And so I understand why small businesses particularly are not understanding what role they can play. I think there's also a bit of a misconception in what they can do to support Indigenous communities. So it doesn't necessarily have to be about sponsoring an Indigenous team in the community or going to powwow. There is, opportunity in supporting other Indigenous businesses and mentoring Indigenous entrepreneurs. And that's really a lot of the work that we're doing at CCIB as well, is saying, even if you're getting someone to do the graphic design for your website, there's Indigenous businesses there that you could work with. And that's part of reconciliation as well. So I think it's all about us really being better at helping people understand what opportunities there are to make those connections.
You allude to procurement there, at least that's what I took from what you just said. And I know that you're very passionate about this, that CCIB has recommended a goal, which the federal government has accepted, I understand. 5% of its procurement is supposed to come from Indigenous businesses.
Right.
How would that look in a private sector business?
So we're seeing in corporations as well that are members of CCIB and are doing that work have made that commitment of a minimum 5% also. And that minimum 5%, is notionally the percentage of Indigenous people in the country. But we would definitely hope that the government exceeds that 5%, and particularly organizations in an area where there is a higher percentage of Indigenous people, there's a greater opportunity there.
Right.
It did take some time to convince the government that there were enough Indigenous businesses in different sectors and different sizes to be able to even meet the 5%. But our research showed that you could exceed it.
Right.
But we see corporations making the commitment. And once they start to even look into their supply chain, some of them are already purchasing from Indigenous businesses that they may not have known were Indigenous business.
Is it about the measurement ultimately and setting and charting a course towards progress of some sort?
I think for sure, and we've had this conversation as well in discussing about government's targets. Is a target just meaning that people are going to get to the 5% and then stop the work?
Right.
But I think we've definitely seen that without setting a target, your organization isn't moving towards that goal. And we see a lot more progress in corporations who are very public about the target that they made and public about how close they are to meeting that target as well. The reason we're so passionate about procurement is it is really an opportunity that every organization and every Canadian citizen and every government can make an impact to support Indigenous business and communities and people. It's really about building that generational wealth again that Indigenous people haven't been able to build.
This is often this conversation among community-minded business leaders, and there are so many, right? It often is viewed through the lens of responsibility, but there's also a tremendous economic opportunity in there here. I mean, the size of the Indigenous economy, it's booming. It's an incredibly young demographic. I think I was reading that there are more than 75,000 Indigenous businesses, in Canada now. So there's actually a tremendous economic opportunity, particularly for businesses that are experiencing a skills shortage, which most businesses say they are in their sectors.
Yeah, I think there's so much opportunity. And it's interesting in speaking to corporate leaders. Sometimes it really is about that they understand that this is the right thing to do as a Canadian corporation. But there are still some that you really need to talk about the return on investment and the opportunity for their business. And definitely skills shortage. We are the fastest growing demographic in the country. So Indigenous youth and Indigenous leaders, there's opportunity there for sure for us to ensure that we can meet those skills shortages if we can improve the education for Indigenous people and Indigenous youth. And then, I think too, when we think about larger projects, projects within a community, hiring people that are within the community, they're not going to be workers that move into the community and then leave the community. They're also very committed to how well that project turns out. And when we think too about environment and climate change, the benefit of having a community as a partner or having people that live on that land and territory working on that project, we see those benefits long term.
And that's something that we all struggle with, right? As a chamber, we're always trying to get governments and businesses alike to do more long-term thinking, right? Not to just think about the next quarter, but to think about, the next 7 generations,
exactly.
right? So I can see the virtue of that kind of thinking.
Yeah. I think it's going to take, and we talk, oftentimes, I get asked what needs to change. And a lot of that is we really need to go at the speed of trust, really. I think decisions are made here on Bay Street in Toronto and in a lot of large boardrooms that are really about the next quarter or aren't thinking about what's the impact 7 generations from now. And we really need to look at both the policy that's moving those business opportunities forward. So if there is procurement happening, government procurement, there needs to be a much longer runway for us to ensure that those relationships are able to be built, and that the capacity is able to be built within the community to be able to be a partner and benefit from those projects as well. Changing governments, it's understandable that that's hard to do, but corporations have a very loud voice. And if we can really get them to understand that this is what is needed, then hopefully we can start to have those longer conversations.
Sure. We talk a lot about changing attitudes and behavior on Bay Street, but ultimately there are an awful lot of people watching here who are small business people. 98% of chamber members are small businesses. And so tell me a little bit about why you strategically choose to engage in the chamber network and how you think local small businesses can make a difference.
So much of it is about getting the word out, right? I think there's still a lot of, I don't want to say bias, but there's still a lot of perception that Indigenous business is like the gas station or arts and culture. And that's just something that we need to continue to change. We need to continue to explain that there are over 75,000 businesses across the country, and they are in every sector, and they are electricians and graphic designers and drywall contractors and IT businesses, and they are in every sector. And the more that we can access through the chamber network to get that word out to businesses and to corporations across the country, the better we can start to change that mindset, and people can really see the opportunity that lies ahead.
So we're going to take a quick break, but we'll return with more from Tabatha Bull very shortly.
As a chamber member, you know you're connected to a network of businesses, resources, and support to help your business grow. But there's another exclusive benefit that's designed just for your business and employees. Introducing Canada's #1 employee benefits plan for your growing business. Drum roll, please. Chambers Plan. It's a not-for-profit plan that pools premiums from over 30,000 businesses, so you can count on stable rates for years to come. Chambers Plan is packed with free value adds, like virtual healthcare for your employees, and consultations with HR and legal experts for your business. Need more options? Customize your plan by adding health spending accounts, lifestyle spending accounts, employee assistance programs, and other best-in-class options. Join a not-for-profit plan that's designed to ensure your business, employees, and local community stay healthy and strong. It's all within reach for chamber members like you.
In June of 2013, southern Alberta experienced a rainfall of historic proportions. More than 100,000 residents were displaced and more than 4,000 businesses were affected. The result was damage in excess of $5 billion, a costly natural disaster. In response, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce formed a business recovery task force, collaborating closely with Calgary's Emergency Management Agency. This activated a series of initiatives to aid businesses as they recovered from the crisis. A business resiliency program, an emergency business contact database, and a comprehensive emergency management tool. These programs assisted countless companies in Calgary get back to business. In fact, more than 99% of affected local businesses were able to reopen after the flood. The initiatives remain in place now, poised as emergency mechanisms that shore up Calgary's recovery preparedness.
Welcome back. Well, I hope you enjoyed our Main Street moment. It's a chance for our network of local chambers and boards of trade across the country to show stories of their strength and resilience. So we're joined again by Tabatha Bull, CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. Well, there's so many good things going on right now, it seems to me, so many exciting things that you're involved in, right? And, when we've talked before, I know you've been very excited about educational programs, about training, scholarships, certification programs. How do you see organizations engaging to really embed reconciliation in their business models and in their DNA?
I mean, we have a program called Partnership Accreditation in Indigenous Relations, which is a certification program that we're over 200 organizations across the country that are involved in now. But the part about that program is that it is really embedded, and it's embedded from the leadership. So it is like a board decision and board mandated work. But the programs that really work and the companies that are doing really good work there is when it's embedded across your organization.
Right.
So not just a conversation that happens in your Indigenous relations team or your diversity equity team, but everyone across the organization is thinking, what are we doing here to support Indigenous business, or how we consider the neighboring Indigenous community, and how can we do better?
Yeah.
From your marketing team to your procurement team, to any team that's going out and engaging with communities. It's really about changing that narrative and mindset across your organization. And like we all know, culture comes from the top. So when we see that that's really embedded in a senior executive team and in the board, and the board's asking those questions, that's where we really start to see that movement and commitment and traction start to happen.
Right.
It's also so important because sometimes you can have a champion within an organization, and when that champion leaves, things slow down or stall. So having that embedded across your policies and across all departments really ensures that that momentum continues and that commitment continues. Not to say that organizations and corporations aren't going to stumble along the way, but that's part of the program too, to say, okay, now there was this error or issue. How did you go about fixing that? How did you go about fixing that with the community? How did you go about changing practices so we know that won't happen again? Mm-hmm. It's really about that embedding across the organization. Right. And we are seeing more and more companies really being public about those commitments also, and being public when they have made an error about, not trying to hide it, sweep it under the rug, but really owning the history of errors that maybe have made and making apologies and talking about how they're going to fix it next time.
Right. A lot of business leaders in this day and age, though, they're very careful about the commitments they make, right?
Yes.
Because they know they're going to be called out about not making them. Do you worry that some will sort of scale back their ambition a little bit? And if so, how do we turn up the heat a little bit to make those commitments more ambitious?
Yeah. It's interesting because it comes back to courage, right? Which we talked about before, about even like entering into the space. We have seen some organizations who have made like a fairly lofty commitment, but been very clear to say, we might not hit it this year, but this is the target where we want to get to.
It's an aspiration.
That's right. And being open about that. Yeah. And I think it definitely opens up an organization to criticism from people who say, you committed to this and didn't meet it. But I think setting a minimum target that you're already going to reach doesn't really move the dial enough. Yeah. And again, it's that honest conversation to say, this is, as you said, the aspiration of where we need to be, and maybe that's a 10-year goal, but this is really what we're moving towards. So looking longer term, again, as we said, versus next quarter or the next year, but as an organization, we're striving to this, partnerships with this many communities, or procurement numbers, or employment numbers of Indigenous people, or Indigenous people in your executive roles. And, those take time to get to those goals. So setting those long-term targets is definitely something that we see as success.
I know that you're doing something quite exciting to contribute to the education of Indigenous professionals. Tell me a little bit about what you've got planned for 2025.
Yeah, so this year we're launching a mini MBA program with Indigenous leaders. So that could be an Indigenous leader that works within an organization, or an Indigenous entrepreneur who wants to, take the time to really be in that space of an MBA learning experience, but with Indigenous speakers coming in and Indigenous case studies and, a more community feel than maybe some standard education spaces and classrooms are as well. So really creating that safe space as well for the students. We're really excited about that program and excited about the partnership as well, because it's been a very open conversation, and we'll be learning along the way as well from the leaders in the class to understand how we can make it better. We've just recently done some work and released some studies on barriers for Indigenous people to be in executive suites and on boards, and that education piece is definitely a gap, and it's kind of a gap in the ecosystem right now. So finding a way for us to be able to help support fill that gap is one, and then on boards, you and I first met doing our board director certification, and understanding how we can get more Indigenous people into boardrooms and around boardroom tables is going to be something that we're really pushing for.
In a very straightforward way for corporations to invest in their Indigenous employees.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, and I sit on a few boards, and I've had Indigenous employees in those organizations say that it means such a big deal to them to have someone on the board who they can identify with.
Right.
But it also brings that conversation, and it shouldn't just be the Indigenous person on the board who's asking the questions about where are we on our reconciliation action plan, or how does this impact?
Or being asked to have all the answers.
Yes, exactly.
Because I've seen that too.
Yes,
right?
that is exactly true. But it does really signify, to the people around the table, but also to the employees and to your shareholders that this is something that's really important as well. And it does drive that conversation. And the more that Indigenous youth can see those Indigenous leaders in those positions, I think the more aspiration they'll have as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
There's the great phrase, you can't be what you can't see.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're talking a lot about education today, right? The education that has to happen within businesses, but also the access for Indigenous professionals to business education. What kind of interest have you had so far from business schools and from potential participants in the program?
We've had really great outreach from the business schools across the country wanting to understand what more they can do to both encourage more Indigenous students in the business programming and to retain them there as well. And content also. When you think about the case studies that are taught within business schools, how are we ensuring that we're celebrating the Indigenous businesses across the country as well, and partnerships that we're seeing. So telling that story. And there are some executive Indigenous courses out west, so we're really excited to have something here in Ontario. And there has been a lot of interest from young Indigenous leaders in a program such as this. I think also, how are we ensuring that, for an entrepreneur and for small business, it's very hard to take time away from your business to participate in education like this. That is so important. So that has been part of our planning and designing of this course, is that we're spreading it out over a longer period of time than a typical mini MBA executive MBA would be, to ensure that, if you're running your own business and you're the only person running that business,
fit into your life.
That's right. You can take some time away. And if you're a leader with a young family, working a full-time job, it's also hard to be able to invest in your education. So really trying to ensure that we can build it in a way that helps support those up-and-coming leaders.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, Tabatha, thank you so much for being so generous with your time with us, and also for the partnership that you've brought to the relationship with the Ontario Chamber. We deeply appreciate it, and I'm really struck by just how you make this accessible to business, right? And that there's a sense of an open hand and an opportunity to do something which is both a responsibility and an opportunity.
The part about TRC is that it's truth and reconciliation, and the truths aren't easy to understand or accept, and there's still lots of Canadians who don't necessarily believe them. But we don't come at this from a place of wanting people to feel guilty. We come at this place of educating and then understanding how we can move forward.
Have you heard about Canada's #1 employee benefits plan for small business? Introducing Chambers Plan. With stable annual premiums supported by a business community over 30,000 strong. And add-ons included at no extra charge. Join a not-for-profit plan that's designed to ensure your business, employees, and local community stay healthy and strong. It's all within reach with Chambers Plan.
For over a century, Ontario's Chambers of Commerce and Boards of Trade have been a driving force, supporting both communities and businesses. Through challenges, we've stood strong, connecting voices and advocating for what matters most. In the spirit of collaboration, we find strength. A network of over 60,000 business owners shaping the future of our province by driving sustainable economic growth and cultivating resilient communities. We are your community partners. Together, we are unstoppable. For more information, visit www.occ.ca/chamber-network-directory.
What a wonderful conversation. And if you're interested in learning more about how you can move your business from good intentions to great actions around reconciliation with Indigenous people, nations, and communities, check out the work that the Ontario Chamber and the Canadian Council on Indigenous Business are doing together. We have a report called The Way Forward, which is designed to give advice to businesses about how they can begin or move faster on their reconciliation journeys. And finally, thanks to our series presenting partner, the Chamber's Plan, Canada's #1 employee benefits plan for small business. The Chamber's Plan is for your benefit. So thanks for watching. You can find the OCC and engage with us on LinkedIn, on X, on Facebook, and on Instagram. See you next time.